Good evening and belated Happy New Year to you all, and welcome back to Have We Got Planning News for You, Season 6. We're delighted to welcome you all back to the show. Delighted to see you, my dear colleagues. Now, first things first, as always, we are still encouraging our viewers to make a donation to charity in lieu of a registration fee. You'll know by now, if you're regular viewers, that our charities of choice that we suggest you donate to include Shelter, the NHS Just Giving page, and also Brian May's Save Me Trust. But if you want to donate to a local charity of choice, that's absolutely fine too. We are delighted to welcome to our first episode of 2022, Nigel Appleton, somebody well known to us all, one of the leading experts over many, many years in relation to specialist older persons accommodation, the author or co-author of a number of well-known government guidance documents in relation to that, for example, More Choice, Greater Voice, which many of you will be familiar with. Nigel, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And can you tell us what theme have you chosen for this evening, in case it hasn't been worked out already by my backdrop? And where are you and what are you drinking?
Well, the theme, of course, is the Republic of Zambia. And I think you're actually on the Zimbabwean.
I was going to say, do you know which side I'm on? I should say.
Yeah, you're on the Zimbabwean side of the Victoria Falls, but that's a minor matter.
Good.
I suggested this because, as I've mentioned to colleagues before, for about 20 years I've been involved in supporting a school in Lusaka, in an area called Ngombe, one of the poorest areas of Lusaka. And it's been a very rewarding experience as we've seen the school grow from 3 children to 500, and now a number of them moving through tertiary education and beginning to give back to the community. So I wanted to celebrate that. Rather small behind me, there's a flag of the Republic of Zambia. I spared you wearing one of my favourite Zambian shirts because I think we'd have had to find a filter to turn the colour down a bit. And what am I drinking? Well, I'm drinking water. I'm drinking water because if you live in that part of Africa, water is crucially important. Not just for drinking and agriculture, but also because it drives hydroelectricity. And I'm speaking to you from my office at home in the village of Cassington in West Oxfordshire.
Fantastic. Well, we're really looking forward to our discussion, which Paul's going to lead with you in the second half of the show. And there's so many important decisions in relation to specialist older persons accommodation in the last few months and years, and a lot to talk about. I must apologise to the one viewer who texted me with excitement yesterday that the All Saint Nicole Appleton was appearing on the show. I'm sorry to disappoint, but Nicole, if you're watching, you're very welcome to join on a future episode. You wouldn't be our first pop star. Anyway, without further ado, let's introduce the rest of the panel, starting with Mary, as always, at the Town Legal offices, I can see.
Absolutely. It's lovely to see you. And you're quite right. I'm in the city in the Town Legal offices. And I'm afraid to say I've slightly let the side down, but this is my sort of African theme. That's the nearest I could get to it. But it's delightful to see you, Nigel. And I think the work that you've been doing sounds highly commendable. And I'm delighted we're back on air, live.
Brilliant. Paul, how are you, mate?
I'm very well, Charlie. How are you?
Very, very good, actually.
Disappointingly, when I went to the Victoria Falls, there was about a 20th of the water coming over the top when I saw it. So my photographs are less impressive, so I haven't put those as the backdrop. However, when I went to Zambia, went on safari, staying in Livingstone, and when we were on safari, we would always stop partway around for a hot chocolate filled with Amarillo, which I can strongly recommend to anybody. It's sort of like Bailey's for the middle classes. It's lovely. So that's what I'm drinking. And I'm in Lancashire, despite the fact I'm able to go into chambers today, apparently, which is all very exciting. I wonder where it is.
And Chris, how are you, mate? You well?
I am. I'm at home. I've had a case management conference today. As you can see, presumption has got completely into the theme. So he is surrounded by elephants. He hasn't spotted that lion behind him, but no doubt he will in a minute. Now, what am I drinking? Well, why wouldn't you have some cobra? Because, of course, in that country is the Mozambique spitting cobra, as you well know, Nigel, that migrates across the border as animals do. But then I thought, hang on, cobra, I'm not having a party, so why wouldn't I be drinking cobra? So instead, I've got this beer, ageless, in honor of you, dear friend.
Very good, very good. Well, Sasha is joining us a bit later. He's still stuck in an inquiry, but he's on his way. But Charlie Banner here from Keating Chambers, just out of my own virtual inquiry. I'm being well behaved too. You probably can't even see that, but it's coconut water. Not because whether or not there are coconuts in Zambia, simply because I'm on good behaviour. My new fitness regime off to the gym with my personal trainer, who's extremely scary after this. And so I've got to be on best behaviour. Anyway, without further ado, let's do our case reports first. So, Mary, you're going to tell us about the Court of Appeal's latest pronunciation in a case about gypsies and travellers.
Yes, quite right. Sorry, I'm just having a fantasy here about Robert Redford, but that's another story. So my case today, as you quite rightly say, is the Court of Appeal. It's a decision, an appeal from Mr. Justice Nicklin. And in the Court of Appeal, we had Sir Geoffrey Voss, who's the Master of the Rolls, sitting with Lord Justice Lewison and Elizabeth Lang. And this case involved a cast of thousands. If you can see, there are only a couple of local authorities named, but can I tell you that there were 36 claimants / appellants, all councils from all over the place, many London boroughs, county councils from Hampshire to Warwickshire to Rochdale to Wolverhampton. There were various interveners. And you can see there those interveners, if your eyesight is keen and acute, they including HS2, Basildon Borough Council, and indeed the Attorney General and some organisations representing gypsies and travellers. And that was because the context of this appeal was about the authorities seeking interim, but in the main, final injunctions against persons unknown. And the case centred around what were labelled newcomers. So that was the label given to unidentified and unknown persons. And really the central question before the Court of Appeal was whether Mr. Justice Nicklin was right to hold that the court cannot grant final injunctions that prevent persons who are unknown and unidentified at the date of the order from occupying and trespassing on local authority land. And the judge ruled that was basically the effect of several other legal authorities, including decisions from the Court of Appeal. There's one called Canada Goose, great names in this case, and another Supreme Court decision called Cameron, which is all about a hit and run driver. Quite an interesting, diverse area of legal decisions. And in Canada Goose, the court relied upon the principle derived from Spycatcher. You remember Spycatcher? That a final injunction only operates between the parties to proceedings. So that was one of the reasons why Mr. Justice Nicklin came to the decision that he did. Now, the leading judgment, the only judgment, was given by the Master of the Rolls, 30 pages. I mean, it really is quite a tour de force. And he went through the authorities I've mentioned, plus some others that the claimants / appellants drew to his attention, Gamble, Ineos and Bromley. And basically, the Court of Appeal came to the view that the judge below had misunderstood some of these authorities, and that both Section 37 of the Supreme Court Act 1981 and Section 187B, that's of course under the Town and Country Planning Act, a specific provision that was inserted in order to be able to achieve injunctions against persons unknown. So the Court of Appeal came to the conclusion that it was indeed possible for final injunctions to be made against persons unknown. So it wasn't something that was restricted to 187B. Good news, as you might imagine, for the authorities and also for HS2. But the court was very clear that there were court procedural rules in place to protect people in this situation, that those rules needed to be applied, and that, of course, they were urging all authorities at all stages to try and engage with persons unknown. And one of the things that you need to do is take photographs of people, try and identify them, make sure they're served with the proceedings, and they have the opportunity to address the court at the relevant moment. Thank you very much. Back to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Millie. Really interesting case. Thanks for that. Now, Chris, you're going to tell us about the latest in the never-ending succession of housing cases in Waverley.
I am indeed. Can I just say, in terms of Mary's case, though, I happen to think that judgment is long overdue. What is the point, honestly, if you can't have the enforcement ability at the end of it? I don't think any of these councils or businesses are rushing off to do it prematurely. And I did a dissertation a very long time ago about injunctions, and you don't have to go through the enforcement procedures at all, or enforcement notices or stop notices. You can go straight to an injunction. Anyway, there we go. For those, we're going to have an enforcement episode, aren't we, at some stage? I know we are. Okay, so my appeal, if Rob brings that up on the screen, is talking about 99 houses in a small village called Alford Crossways in Surrey, which is in the borough of Waverley. The appellant was Thacum Homes and the Merchant Seamen's War Memorial Society. The fact it was a charity actually does feature in the case. The inspector placed us some way. I think that's absolutely right. I think if you are supporting a charity, that should be a material consideration. Just saying. Now we've got an OS map which shows us where this particular site is. There you go. There is Alford Crossways. There's an Alford and an Alford Crossways. Both of them pretty small. Look at that. You'd probably fill the pub up, wouldn't you, if everybody went to the pub on one day. And then if we have a look at the next shot, you can see where the red line is, but that was the proposal. So it's a substantial number of houses in what is a relatively small village. Now, we see a vast number of housing appeals refused. It's about 70%. And this, despite the fact the government itself acknowledged in 2013, we're in a housing crisis, and quite a few people, myself included, find ourselves scratching our heads a bit at those statistics, because the inspectors aren't like the politicians. They're not under local pressure. They're there to make a decision in the context of the fact we have got a housing crisis. So, and of course, a massive need for affordable housing. Well, I tell you what, reading this decision, as I've done, all 28 pages of it, has restored my faith in the appeal system. It's a real tonic, I tell you, for anybody who's had an appeal turned down. Now, the council claimed it had a 5-year land supply. The inspector was Harold Stevens. Have a guess which way that went. They claimed 5.2. The appellants argued for much lower than that, and he settled on 4.01 years. He takes a robust approach to the definition of deliverable, which of course he should do, because the PPG requires robust evidence. And actually, whilst this inquiry was ongoing, I was in the High Court defending his Sonning Common decision, which Nigel very kindly helped with. And his approach there was that, you needed clear evidence, and the High Court upheld him. So this is really a very good read for lots of different reasons. If we have a look at the issue of the size of the settlement, because this was a big issue for the council said that, let me just have a look at it. Sorry, first of all, just deal with this paragraph 16, the most important policies. Now, we often have a debate about this. The inspector makes clear, as you can see in paragraph 16, second sentence, its reference, that's the MPPF, to application, the policy is most important for determining the application, as opposed to appeal, means it isn't just those in the reason for refusal. It can be policies beyond the reason for refusal. This is often the case with housing policies. They're often not mentioned in the reason for refusal, but of course they're the most important, amongst the most important for determining a housing appeal. Anyway, he considers this matter, and as you can see at paragraph 18, he lists a whole series of policies which are out of date in terms of the local plan. Having found there was a shortfall in the 5-year land supply, of course, they're all automatically out of date. And there's a lesson to local authorities. If you litter your reasons for refusal full of policies, as is often the case, and you haven't got a 5-year land supply, then unfortunately they're all out of date. And that can help your appeal enormously. We should be more circumspect, frankly, about putting some of the policies in the reasons for refusal. Now, if we move on to paragraph 26, we had an issue. There was an issue here, obviously, as you can see from the maps, about the size of the settlement. And the council said, we think there should only be 125 houses in Alford and Alford Cross. And they referred to a reference in the development plan to that effect. But it wasn't a maximum figure. It was only a minimum figure. And there had already been 125 homes built or had permission in this settlement. So the council's case was there should only be a few more, and the inspector was having none of it. Look at this. As I perceive it, there's no cap in the policy, ALH1. If the examining inspector or the council had wanted to impose a cap in the local plan, they could have done so in the policy. Reading the policy objectively, it must therefore be assumed that there was a positive decision not to impose a cap. And I couldn't agree more. All this assumption, he goes on to say, you wouldn't expect it to be unlimited, but he certainly didn't think that the fact they'd already had 125 inhibited it. And also, of course, there's no 5-year land supply. That was his finding. So how do you solve a 5-year land supply if you keep saying, well, we'll stick to the existing strategy? That won't work either, will it? It's a very good read, and he takes a pragmatic view in terms of rural areas with reference to paragraph 105 of the MPPF. His approach to the benefits, I think, is perfect because he lists all 8 of them in paragraph 111, including separating out the benefits of housing and affordable housing. When we see inspectors against a scheme, they often just sort of roll all that together and say, oh, well, the housing is a benefit. But here he separates them out and indeed 8 different factors, all of which he finds in favour. Now, can I link this appeal decision to a certain African country? Yes, I can, because if we look at paragraph 26, we can see there's reference to another appeal decision, and there is reference in there. Rob's now wondering, where's Chris going with this?
We all are, mate.
Look at that. Paragraph 29, Springboks. They get mentioned. Look at that. Tying that to African wildlife. And as for the appearances, if we have a look at the appearances, we can see one of our very own. It's Sasha White there with Matthew Fraser. And there's the team with Tim Burden from Turley's acting as the planning consultant. So well done to all of those. But most of all, well done to Harold Stevens. Please don't retire anytime soon.
Thanks, Chris. Well, I'm going to do the next case, and that concerns a Persimmon Homes development in Fareham Borough Council's area. There's a proposal for 202 dwellings, and originally there were 10 reasons for refusal. In total. By the time of the inquiry, or certainly by the time of the end of the inquiry, it's not totally clear which, they'd been stripped down to 2 reasons, one of which was an ecology point, which really went to conditions and obligations about nitrates and other impacts on SAC. And the real critical issue was the effect of the development on the character and appearance of the landscape and the surrounding area. And the context was there was a lack of a 5-year supply. It was agreed to be between 3.17 and 3.57, so a considerable shortfall. And that was the context. That triggered a policy in the Fareham Development Plan, which allowed for developments to take place outside settlement boundaries on greenfield unallocated sites where there was a 5-year supply shortfall, subject to certain criteria, one of which was proportionality to the scale of the shortfall, others related to the effects of the development. Now, interestingly, and I think tellingly, the objection as articulated by the council wasn't to the principle of development of the site. In fact, it was an emerging allocation, and they'd accepted that there's going to be some development on the site, and that inevitable impacts of greenfield development weren't enough to sustain a refusal. The focus instead was on the design. There's a range of specific design issues put forward, largely to do with how the development edges interrelated with the wider area. Was the landscaping going to be sufficiently robust and appropriate? Part of the site backed onto a cemetery, and there are issues about the interrelationship with that in terms of noise and overlooking. And the inspector had none of it. The inspector considered that the scheme was for a range of reasons, completely appropriately well designed, and rejected all those allegations, found that there was compliance with that safety valve policy that allowed for developments outside settlement boundaries, whether the 5-year supply shortfall, found that that overrode other policy conflicts to do with settlement boundaries and allowed the appeal. Why is this appeal of interest? Because a number of the design issues are sort of obviously fact specific to development. I think the decision of interest for probably two main reasons, which are interconnected. Firstly, it's probably indicative of what I expect is a trend that's already started and certainly likely to continue, about opponents of development using design as if like as the new trump card, rather than being perhaps a little bit cuter than simply saying we object in principle to the development of this greenfield site, but using design and using the revised provisions of the framework and the National Design Guide as a basis to resist development. And secondly, the sort of counter side of that is the new Persimmon, the new volume house builders. Obviously, in the past, Persimmon and other volume house builders have been criticised. I won't say whether rightly or wrongly, I'll leave that for others to judge, but they've been criticised for the quality or otherwise of their design. And the house builders, certainly the PLC volume house builders that I work with, they've taken the new Building Beautiful provisions very seriously. And I think the endorsement the inspector makes of the design of the Persimmon scheme here is telling. I mean, they did an inquiry at Persimmon last week where a design was actually used as a front foot point, and a design proof was prepared to show how the development would come forward in keeping with the Building Beautiful agenda. And so I think that's quite interesting too. So something which opponents of development are likely to rely on increasingly, but also those who've been criticised for the not so good quality of their design in the past, taking the Building Beautiful agenda seriously. And congratulations to the Persimmon team who were upheld in that case.
This segment has been sponsored by Persimmon Homes.
That's somebody you've acted for recently, Charlie. I didn't pick that up at all.
And one last little nugget, as I'm well within my time, in case anybody isn't aware already. We covered about a year ago the Hillside, almost over a year ago, the Hillside judgment in the Court of Appeal about successive planning permissions and the application of Pilkington principle. In case you didn't know, the Supreme Court have granted permission to appeal on that site. So the judgment of the Court of Appeal upholding the High Court, taking a very sort of restrictive approach to whether drop-in permissions can be implemented without undermining the ability to rely on the rest of the master permission. That judgment is now up for review by the Supreme Court, and a hearing is likely between May and July. So watch this space.
Who's doing that case, Charlie? Who's doing that?
I can't think. I don't know. Well, if they win, it'll be despite their barrister rather than because of it. Let's just say that.
Just shameless. You really
There it is.
Why not tell us what you're doing next week, Charlie?
We won't go there, honestly, trust me. Now, we don't have Sasha. He's obviously still plodding away at his inquiry, so we'll go straight to our interview. Extra time with Nigel. So, Paul, over to you to give Nigel a fuller introduction than I did and to kick off our chat with him. And by the way, please, viewers, please do post any questions you'd like us to ask in the Q&A. Do it in the Q&A rather than chat, and we'll ask as many of those as we can to Nigel. So over to you, Paul.
Good afternoon, Nigel. I was going to start off by greeting you with one of the languages in Zambia to say hello. But when I went online to try and remind myself how I meant to say hello in Zambia, there's about 12 different ways or about a dozen different tribes. So I'm going to pick one, which is the area that I went to. So for the Bemba tribe, can I say Shani to you? Which I think means hello.
So my limited vocabulary of Bemba also manages Shani.
Well, at least I got it right in terms of the selection of the 12. Anyway, so we're talking about specialist accommodation for the elderly, Nigel, and you are uniquely well placed to discuss that subject. That's not because of the gravitas that you bring to bear in terms of your tender years, but because of your extraordinary experience. But your life has not just been involved in this sector. You've had an extraordinarily varied life, having started off life as a minister in the United Reformed Church until 1984, when you decided to make a career break and join the rest of us. But you went into anchor housing initially, went through the ranks from that period of time. You ended up working for a series of remarkable organisations, particularly the Roundtree Foundation. And by 2004, you had sufficient expertise to be authoring documentation on matters for the elderly for the Department of Health. So you've risen through the ranks, advising government and also advising not just the public sector, but also the private sector for the last 10 years of your life. So I'm very interested, Nigel, based upon the wealth of your experience. Can we start off with just identify what is extra care housing and why should we be interested in it?
I have a sort of working definition of my own, that it should be a good place to live in old age when you're fit and able, but with the capacity to respond flexibly as your need for care changes, whether that change is short term, like following a fall or discharge from hospital, or it's longer term. I mean, more sort of technically, I guess the key features are a self-contained dwelling in a complex with a range of facilities that encourage activity and engagement, and crucially, with an on-site care team who can provide 24-hour care, a 24-hour care service. That's all because it allows older people moving in there to maintain the quality of their accommodation. They don't find themselves going from a 3-4 bedroom house, or in the case of most of you chaps, you know, a sort of 12-bedroom mansion, I imagine. But for the rest of us, going from that sort of a size of accommodation down perhaps to a single room in a care home. And to make that allows them to maintain their privacy, to maintain their independence in a setting where they can participate in communal life as much or as little as they please. So it's a win-win in very many ways for individuals, for their families, and for the community at large.
So my initial experience of specialist accommodation for the elderly was going to see my Auntie Kitty, who was then in her 80s, in a tiny little local authority bungalow in Scarborough with the warden on the door. You've experienced for the last 20 years or so, and apologies for the dog in the background, you've experienced for the last 20 years or so a change in how provision has happened. Obviously, that's beyond the last 20 years. How would you characterise that change in the provision of accommodation for the elderly?
Well, essentially, I think that it's diversity. It's the diversification of the offer. When I started sort of 40 years ago, there was a basic typology. You could either stay in your existing home and cope as best you could. You could move into sheltered housing with some level of support, although it was pretty much informal. It was more oversight than active doing things for you. And if that wasn't sufficient, then you moved into a residential care home or a nursing home. And in fact, when I first started, there were still some long stay hospital beds for older people too, within the NHS. And all of those moves involved a trade-off between your independence and your care. Care homes, certainly then, generally had a majority of shared rooms, little in the way of ensuite facilities. Most sheltered housing was in the social rented sector. And now we've got much greater diversity. We've got enhancements to standard sheltered housing. We've got availability across tenures, but still not proportionate to the distribution of tenure choice among older people. And we've got the emergence of extra care as a viable alternative to residential care, which is a win for both the individuals involved and for public finances.
And how does provision in this country differ from provision elsewhere? Are we typical or atypical in the experience you've had?
Well, we were slow to catch up. When I started in this area, obviously there was better practice in some parts of Europe. I remember taking representatives of local authorities to visit schemes in Scandinavia and in Germany back in the late 90s, and Australia, for example, was streets ahead in moving really from a different direction, from moving out of large scale residential care and nursing home care to towards a more housing-based solution. We were a bit slow out of the blocks, but subsequently, I think the practice in the UK, especially now, stands comparison with anywhere in the world.
And in terms of the need for specialist accommodation for the elderly, government in PPG describes there being a critical need. It's the only part of guidance that talks about need being qualified by such an extreme adjective. So a critical need for additional specialist accommodation, which anybody who's even glanced at the demographics of this country would appreciate arises from the changes. But how on earth have we not seen this coming? How have we got into the mess where we're now at the position in 2022 where there's a critical need for a form of accommodation, which many of us on the call will be needing in the near future? That's me, not you.
Well, it's probably me as well.
Well, I should say, Nigel, I got the letter from my private pension company this week saying, how do you intend to use your pension when it comes out? I'm going to 54, for goodness sake. Anyway, sorry, I've interrupted your answer.
No, not at all. I mean, I think there are a number of reasons. First of all, the options are not well known. And in promoting them, certainly in the public sector in particular, the emphasis has tended to be on care and on need. And there's a hangover of antipathy to institutional forms. You probably remember when your aunt was in sounds like category 1 sheltered housing in Scarborough. She was looked after by a warden. I mean, what does that conjure up? It's no longer used within the sector, but it's still in the folk memory. And plus, I belong. I mean, I'm about 20 years ahead of you in this, as you know. And my generation, I think, is in denial about its future self. Those of us who grew up in the 50s and 60s still live there in our heads. And in many ways, it was a better time than some features of our society now. And we're reluctant to realise our future needs. And public policy and initiatives are focused on those needing social rented solutions. And it strikes me as someone relatively recent to the world of planning, that there is a sort of innate resistance to private provision, although 75% of older people are homeowners and need that sort of solution. And we've tended, in relation to the needs of old age, to be reactive rather than proactive in our approach. If we had a more positive image of what our senior years might hold, then I think the relevance of this offer would be much more readily grasped and acted upon.
So why do you think the promotion of schemes for extra care and the like are so controversial? Why do you think so many local authorities don't act proactively to meet that need by identifying sites and bringing them forward?
Well, public authorities tend to focus on those who won't be able to provide or won't be able to access the accommodation and care they need without assistance. And that's quite right and appropriate. And I entirely agree with that. But there's an assumption that those who have the assets in their house can provide for themselves. And I remember when I was first involved in this area, in assisting elderly owner-occupiers in Brixton to repair and improve and adapt their homes, that there's an assumption that they've got an asset, they can find a solution for themselves. The truth is you can only buy what's on the shelf. You can only access what's in the marketplace. And there's a widespread lack of appreciation of the economics of provision. The communal facilities and the sort of the corridor widths and the other spaces needed to get accessibility standards, all of those cost money. They add to cost. And if facilities are used by choice rather than compulsion, for example, if a restaurant's provided and you're not charged for it whether you use it or not, but you have the choice whether to use it or not, you need a certain scale. And a scale that works in the social rented sector, quite often with public subsidy, won't work in the private sector. And so there's a resistance to scale. There's a failure to engage with the practicalities of provision of some of these emerging models.
But it's interesting. We look at a school and think a development for a school is socially needed and therefore has to be this big. A hospital or a GP surgery has to be of this design. But when we look at a scheme for extra care, which also has those requirements in terms of the critical mass and the needs, we seem as the general public not to recognise that, well, you might need something that's a bit different from what's there already if it's a couple of Victorian villas. Why do you think that nettle hasn't been grasped by the planning system generally?
I think it's difficult to tell. It's because there is a model. I mean, the model which has emerged to in the social rented sector, which is of a scale which seems to be accepted as some sort of norm by planning authorities, for example. The scale required when you elaborate the facilities or when you look at other tenures is quite different.
Nigel, my last question before handing over to my colleagues was going to be a question with regard to the pandemic and the effect on specialist accommodation. But in the light of Charlie's observation about thinking that we've got Nigel Appleton on, I was very tempted to ask you what it's like having Liam Gallagher as a son-in-law. But I won't ask you that. I'll stick to my original question. Can I just ask you to reflect on the pandemic for a moment? To what extent do you think that having managed care for some of the most vulnerable people in our society at a time of national crisis has illustrated or not illustrated the importance of such facilities in a societal sense?
Well, I think the evidence which has emerged over the last couple of years is that there have been better outcomes in housing-based provision than in institutional care. And it's hard to make exact comparisons because medical status and vulnerabilities will be varied. But the accommodation-based models have shown that they're more resilient. And that's partly because people can continue to live behind their own front door. Services can be discreetly delivered to them if they have an infection, for example. And all the evidence from extra care developments has been of a much more flexibility in the way in which they can respond to those needs.
Thank you, Nigel. I'm going to hand over to my colleagues. And first, Mary, do you have a question for Nigel?
I do have a question for Nigel, but I also just wanted to draw attention to this, meeting housing needs. This is from the Built Environment Committee of the House of Lords, Baroness Neville Rolfe in the chair, because A, I've asked the Baroness to be a guest, and B, if anybody out there has any contacts with the Baroness, I'd really like to hear from them. And also because I just wanted to draw attention, and forgive me, Nigel, because I didn't forewarn you of this. I feel like a barrister about to cross-examine you, having dropped a new document on you, which is a really cheap trick.
I have some experience of. Yeah.
I bet you do. I bet you do. But there's a really interesting section here on housing for the elderly. And there are some great statistics, and the government's response is very interesting because it's making the point that this is not something that the planning system alone can solve, that it's something that requires government departments, including the Department of Health and Social Care and the Treasury, as well as the Levelling Up lot, to really focus on. And it's actually saying that really in the last 20 years, we haven't really made much progress. Which is in part your point. Anyway, I don't want to quote the stats at you, but let's come back to my question, really, which I was wondering what you thought the biggest single factor was holding people back holding back private housing schemes. Why isn't there more interest in it? Why? And the point that this meeting housing demand is making is people say they're interested, but actually when it comes to it, very few of them actually move. Do we need to have some more interventions, some more incentivizations, whether those are fiscal? What is it that we can do to help?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've already touched on the negative psychology around past provision, and where we can make a change. I think it is in trying to make it clear that things have moved on, that we're not talking about the previous forms. I mean, I think in addition to the document you've mentioned, the references to housing in the social care white paper also point us in a very similar direction and say that housing as a context for care is the only way in which we're going to cope with the care needs of an ageing population. And of course, you haven't quoted the stats at me, but what the stats show is that although some provision has grown, some positive models have increased, they're not increasing fast enough to keep pace with the ageing of the population. There are also holes in the range of affordability.
Agreed. Agreed.
So although the majority of provision is still in the social rented and affordable sector, and then often there's quite a big jump to premium provision. I'm aware that McCarthy and Stone and my old organisation, Anchor Hanover, are attempting to respond to that, but it needs more attempts to respond positively to filling that gap in the middle range.
And one of our listeners is saying, Stephanie is saying that she thinks the language puts people off. I think I agree with that, Stephanie. I think there are sort of many things that put people off, including some rather unimaginative models. Anyway, I mustn't hog you, but this is a subject which is near and dear to me. Thank you very much, Paul.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. Sasha, welcome.
Thank you. I'm slightly fear I've joined the High Court because you're now a very grand High Court judge who has a clock behind him telling how long your submissions are going to be. Mr. White, you've got till 05:48.
So you've now got an opportunity to question Nigel, and you've got it in 35 seconds starting from now.
See if I can laugh for 35 seconds. Nigel, good afternoon.
25
Lovely
now.
to see you, and forgive me for being late. I hope
at
there's
all.
room in one of your developments for me after the day I've had, but that's another story. The question I was going to ask you, would it help in terms of delivery of dedicated facilities for those of a slightly older vintage to amalgamate C2 and C3?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer that, really, but I would say that the current situation tends to drag proposers of schemes to emphasise dependency so that they fall into C2. And in my view, that's unhelpful for precisely the reasons that have just been mentioned. It adds to that negative psychology. It leads into an unhelpful vocabulary. My view would be that it needs a subclass of its own. We've come a heck of a long way since 1987, which, as my memory serves, was when the current structure of use classes was put in place. And we want something that recognises, amongst other things, the financial realities of this style of development, rather than having to find colleagues who'll give evidence on viability to prove that whatever line the local authority takes in regarding its C2 or C3, there's a limit to what this style of development can contribute because of the additional costs that I've mentioned.
Thank you. Paul?
Thanks, Sasha. and it's extraordinarily tempting to continue the C2, C3 debate, but we'll see our audience numbers dropping off, I suspect, notwithstanding its importance. Something for government to reform quickly. Chris, it's a joy to see you on the screen, by the way, because it looks like you've been pushed across the screen by 4 animals.
Yes.
It's almost as if you're in the zoo. Do you have a question for Nigel?
Or pushed across the screen by 4 animals who I meet on a fortnightly basis. Yeah, I mean, my take on it, Nigel, and you know this because we do lots of appeals together, is that actually what people have not appreciated is that, of course, extra care operators cannot compete with the house builders because they can't offer the same money for the land because they've got these communal facilities which are non-profit making. That's a key part of it. And actually, the reality is, you know, why do we keep talking about housing numbers as 800 houses for mid-Sussex a year? Why don't we break it up? Why don't we identify how many bungalows we need? Let's identify how much extra care, how much McCarthy and Stone kind of sheltered accommodation. And actually, some people might be able to relate to the numbers more than 800 a year, rather than, you know, break it down, 300 houses, family houses, 200. You know, I've raised this for Simon Gallagher and those in the department. I think it would be a lot better way to sell housing and easy to relate to. But my question, Nigel, is this: how would you like planners, and particularly planning officers and members, to see extra care? Because they seem to have a very negative view of it.
Well, I would like planners and people at large to recognise it as offering a context for a positive old age. And if not for themselves, then perhaps for their parents. I mean, the number of times that when you and I have been in inquiry and outside the inquiry, people who have objected have subsequently signed up for the development, if not for themselves, then for their parents. But most of all, I think the key to this is a new paradigm that emphasizes the benefit. We've got dragged into this notion that somehow this is a welfare provision with a threshold of incapacity to qualify for it. And that makes it, in a sense, a bad news story. And we need to embrace it as a good news story. This is a context for a good old age. And I think all of us in the sector need to do our damnedest to get that message across and to emphasize those facilities and those benefits and those possibilities that are there for older people if they will embrace this and a variety of other provision. You know, we're talking about a quarter to a third, and in some places more, of a local population. There's enormous diversity across the range of older people in any community. Their needs are not all the same, and we need to promote a range of attractive and affordable opportunity.
Couldn't agree with you more.
Thanks, Chris. Charlie, do you have a question for Nigel?
I do, Nigel. I was going to ask you. You may have already answered it to some degree just now, but you know, is the one reform to either the planning system or planning policy that you would see as delivering a greater amount of necessary specialist older persons housing? And you know, if what you just said is the answer, then a sort of a riff off the same theme is, what about a sort of 5-year supply test specifically for either specialist older persons accommodation generally or the categories, something that has a bit more teeth? So what are your thoughts on those issues?
I think both that suggestion and the suggestion that Chris was making before, that there should be some differentiation when we're talking about what future housing need is. It's difficult, of course, because there isn't an easy formula for settling on how much is enough. We can demonstrate the population, the numbers who might need this sort of provision in our judgment, but the numbers who will choose it may be a different matter. So it's not as formulaic as the standard method for population, the needs of the whole population.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. I mean, it's interesting your point about the paradigm of aging, Nigel, just picking up on that and contrasting my brother-in-law, who's just turned 60 in the States, keeps telling me how much he's looking forward to retiring to Florida, to go to a retirement community in Florida. It's his aspiration and looking forward to that. Whereas when I speak to my mother and say, well, you're starting to struggle a little bit, it's don't you put me in one of those homes. And the whole mentality is so radically different. And how we get to that paradigmatic change, I'm not sure. But I welcome your thoughts. One of the suggestions from our audience is that, I think it's Claire Howe, suggests that members should go round extra care facilities to have a look at them and see the benefits of them as a site visit. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's an excellent idea, and in a number of the appeals that I've been involved with yourself and with Charlie and with Chris, operators where an operator is aboard, they've taken certainly the inspector and often others too to see what we're talking about, because in lots of areas it's still simply not there, and if you haven't experienced it, it's very hard, I think, to see the benefits and not to be stuck in this outdated approach and set of assumptions about what it will be like.
Paul?
Yes, Chris.
Paul, we've got lots of, this is a very popular episode. We've got a huge audience, unsurprisingly, Nigel. Everybody loves you, frankly. We've got some questions, Paul. I think we should ask some of these questions. There's one from Richard Ford of Pinson's, and he says, Nigel, what do you think of multi-generational living models versus extra care? So those, I think they've got them in the Netherlands, haven't they? Or certainly try to involve younger people in the lives of older people so that you're not just with your own demographic.
Yeah, I mean, there are a variety of other models, both here and elsewhere. Intergenerational living. There's a wonderful report from a development in Belgium a number of years ago called Kangaroo Living, which was about older people taking younger people into occupy spare rooms in their home, and the scheme sort of providing a vetting and a management service, and what the younger people paid for accommodation was moderated by the provision of some domestic help. So there are lots of possibilities out there. I would say, though, I don't think it's one or the other.
No.
It's different options at different points across a range to meet the diversity of circumstances and preference and whatever lifestyle.
I mean, there's some interesting stuff in this meeting housing demand about co-living which is quite popular in the Netherlands, and hasn't really caught on. But that sounds like another very interesting model. So you come together in certain aspects of life, because I think loneliness is a massive issue for older people, and coming together in some sort of community living can really help to alleviate loneliness. I think there's a fear of people not wanting to move out of the homes they've lived in for all those years. Completely understandable. You have memories of those homes, but it does result in a lot of people being very lonely, and also having the burden of having to maintain, a huge property, which is,
I come back to my desire to shift the paradigm, because you've just mentioned two of the major benefits. And if we're talking about benefit, then we get a completely different psychology in thinking about the options. And I have to say that one or two strong souls have been plugging away at co-housing in the UK for the last 20 or more years, but there's been only a limited amount of take-up. But it's another option in the range.
Nigel, thank you very much indeed for your time. That's been absolutely fascinating. I think we could sit in and listen to you talking about your experience and your thoughts for the rest of the evening. But can I finish off by saying thank you in Bemba, so Natoteli. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Charlie, Over
Huge
to you.
thanks from me, Nigel, us too. Really, really fascinating. Such an important conversation. Well, we're as we announced in the file, we're going to be returning to twice monthly episodes. So we're going to be back on the 3rd of February.
Isn't it nice to be back?
I know, I can't wait. It has just occurred to me I'm going to be on an aeroplane at the time we show on the 3rd of February, but that's for onboard Wi-Fi. Chris is dying to tell us who we've got. Our next guest, Chris. So over to you.
I absolutely am, Charlie, but I thought that was your role, and so I'll just hand that back.
No, we will post our details of our next 3 guests actually online very, very shortly. We can't wait to see you in 2 weeks' time. In the meantime,
just before you go, Charlie, just to answer Catherine Guttridge's question of us about when we're getting a show on enforcement, it's going to be April when we've got Arsene Ghaffur, who's in charge of enforcement at PINS, who's coming on the show. So watch out for that one.
Yeah, can I just say, first of all, Sasha, thank you very much for coming. A bit like the Americans in the war. You're very, very late, but we're nice to see you.
And I'll get without you.
And the second thing is, Charlie, yeah, absolutely. What we've got next time on the 3rd of February is a really, really important debate. We've got Vicky Gahagan, who is she's the president of the Planning Officers Society. And is there a bigger issue in planning right now than the unbearable pressure and lack of resources on planning officers? I don't think there is. That's why we decided to invite her on, and she's going to be telling us all about that and the solutions to that. And that'll be a really interesting episode on the 3rd of February.
And we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody. Thank you again to Nigel, and Happy New Year once again. Cheerio, everybody.
Cheers, guys.
Bye.